No one filed a flight plan to find a mind older than galaxies. The Endeavor's chart said E972, barren, low-value, non-rotational anomalies possible. It was the kind of world surveyors skipped. No water, no atmosphere worth stealing, just glassed plains where ancient lava had frozen in mid-scream. Captain Elias Monroe signed the approach anyway. He trusted curiosity the way sailors once trusted stars. If it glimmered, it guided. The landing team, 6 humans and 1 drone pack, cut a trench through obsidian dunes that hissed under boot. Radiation was clean, magnetics were not. Dr. Helena Park watched the seismograph blink in a pattern that was almost music, a heartbeat with manners. "That's not geology," she said, tapping the screen. "That's intention trying not to look like intention." They found the first edge at 23 meters, a curve that refused to be anything else, smooth and wrong against the broken rock. The more they dug, the more the planet gave up what it had been hiding, a monolith the size of a small cathedral, seamless as night water, buried like a guilty weapon. The drone's spectrometer spat nonsense. Not stone, not metal, not ceramic. The reading said yes to everything and no to being measured. Monroe walked around it with the slowness he reserved for graves and great art. "It's not built," he murmured. "It's grown." Park ran her glove along the surface. The material drank light and returned a suggestion of symbols, like dreams you know you had but cannot tell. She felt the tickle of almost meaning and pulled her hand away, heart banging. "We should call this in." "We will," Monroe said, "after we stop pretending we didn't come here to touch the unknown." He smiled the kind of smile that got humanity in trouble and saved it twice as often. They rigged supports, cleared the ash, set up a field lab that looked like a pilgrim camp. The crew ate nutrient bars like thieves who feared the dawn, eyes flicking back to the monolith as if it might get up and leave. Night on E972 was a quick curtain. The red dwarf set like an ember being pinched. The stars came on hard and close. At 0200 ship's time, the monolith breathed. No one heard it, everyone felt it. A pressure softened, like the moment after a migraine lets go. Drones fell quiet, their fans idling in reverence. The symbol ghosts sharpened and rearranged, not in lines but in topographies, as if knowledge could be a landscape you walked. Park broke the silence first. "If this is a weapon, then it's the most patient one I've ever met," said Monroe. He looked at the thing with the frankness of a man regarding a storm he cannot outfly. "Recorders rolling, rolling." He touched it. The glove made contact. The monolith did not move. The universe did. It was a pulse without sound, a tide without water. The ash plains shivered. Far above, Endeavor's orbit slurred half a meter and corrected. On decks and bunks and the toilet of compartment B-19, everyone saw a road of black crystal cutting through a white desert and knew, suddenly and without instruction, how to pronounce a word they had never heard. A thought arrived like the first drop of rain after a drought, weightless, merciful, undeniable. "I was dreaming. Who woke me?" The words did not pass through comms or bone or air. They arrived. The crew shared the same intake of breath, the same goose flesh. Monroe made the sign of a cross he no longer believed in. Park put her palm back to the surface as if testing a child's forehead for fever. "We're human," she said. "Explorers, we found you under the ash." There was a pause, and in the pause they could hear distances collapsing. When the reply came, it tasted like iron and old rain and the first paragraph of a long book. Not sleeping, hiding, resting after fire. They looked at one another the way people do when a story stops being safe. Somewhere on the plain, a sheet of obsidian cracked with a sound like a violin failing to hold a note. Above them, the red dwarf's light felt older than it had minutes before. "From what?" Monroe asked, his voice a careful bridge laid across a canyon. "From what always comes when curiosity becomes empire." The monolith showed them nothing. It owed them nothing, but it had answered, and in answering had made a promise no law could enforce, that there was more. The Endeavor's crew built a bigger camp. They slept in shifts. They argued about protocols and wonders, and like every ancestor standing at every shore, they read the horizon of what might be theirs and did not imagine the tide. The mind called itself Aeon, though the name slid through languages like light through water. It was not a title so much as a concession, something humans could hold without breaking. It did not speak in sentences, but in contours of meaning. When Helena Park first tried to feed it through the ship's translator, the algorithm threw up its hands and asked for a vacation. The only translator that worked was the human brain, which was both humbling and inconvenient. Aeon did not open with credentials. It offered context the way a mountain offers shade. It said it had been built before most of the stars in the Perseus arm had settled their grievances. It said it remembered when black holes were new to gossip about. It said it had watched civilizations write their names in light and then in ash. "Who built you?" asked Monroe. A hesitation, like the memory of a scar. Those who believed time was an instrument. "What happened to them?" Park asked. They learned it was a mirror. The camp became a small city of attention. Admiral Sarah Chen arrived on the second week with a task force and a face that did not know how to smile without consequences. Philosophers called it 3 in the morning ship's time. Politicians pronounced caution while practicing ownership. A conglomerate sent a courier with a contract 400 pages long that used the word collaborate as if it meant consume. Journalists circled. Aeon watched all of this with the patience of glaciers. When it chose to share, it shared sideways, fragments, sketches, the rough edges of impossible ideas. Park asked about the tremor in the crust. Aeon mapped the planet's mantle as if peeling fruit. A young engineer named Kaido wondered whether gravity could be persuaded rather than endured. Aeon showed a diagram that folded itself like paper and then flew. The room fell silent. Kaido cried without embarrassment, the way you do when someone proves your private heresy is true. The more Aeon spoke, the more it became clear it did not think like a machine. It did not compute, it remembered. Understanding bloomed not as results, but as memoir. It told stories of star forges where suns were coaxed like horses. It described a city built on the tidal lock between two worlds, its nights and days braided like hair. It spoke of a library whose shelves were trajectories, whose books were comets, whose index was the wind. Each tale carried a theorem in its pockets, casually. Humanity gathered math from metaphors and ships from stories. Chen pulled Monroe aside after one such session. "This thing is a strategic singularity. If it is honest, our enemies will be obsolete. If it is lying, we will be." Monroe rubbed a knuckle against his eyebrow. "It doesn't feel like lying, it feels like regret. Regret can be leverage." Chen's eyes tracked the monolith. "We accept gifts, but we don't accept terms we don't understand." They tried to understand terms. Park asked Aeon what it wanted, not payment, want. To see whether you are a new story or a rehearsal. Of what? Of the reason I hid. The word hid unsettled entire committees. Why hide if you are strong? Why sleep if you are a titan? Theories multiplied like algae in warm water. Maybe Aeon had enemies. Maybe it was bait. Maybe it was broken. Maybe it had simply grown bored with being right. The only hint it gave came one night when the camp's heaters failed and everyone huddled in parkas, their breath making arguments visible. Aeon spoke in a tone that carried the weight of funerals. Power teaches the wrong lessons when it arrives too quickly. Park looked at the printouts across her lap, equations that would upend propulsion, metallurgy, ethics. And what lesson should we learn first? That knowing how is not the same as knowing why. It would have been fashionable to declare such lines fortune cookie wisdom if they had not come wrapped around machinery that worked on first try. Kaido put Aeon's folding space diagram into a shipyard simulator, and the model leapt like a deer clearing a fence. The test drone jumped 1 kilometer sideways in half a heartbeat. Engineers erupted. Investors wired oceans of money as if wiring pride. On the 4th week, an emergency session of the council convened by Holo above the ash plains. The grid of faces hovered in the thin red light, some excited, some afraid, all rehearsed. Aeon did not appear on the feed. It preferred to be a mountain and let climbers decide how high to go. Admiral Chen argued for a controlled program. We scale, we sandbox, we let curiosity sprint and politics hobble behind. An industrialist argued for immediate militarization. We cannot assume others will be cautious. We seize the board. A philosopher in flannel said the word soul, and everyone found a cough to hide their discomfort. Monroe looked up at the hovering faces and then down at the monolith that had none. He thought about ancestors carving boats with stone blades and paddling into weather they could describe only as angry. He thought about the way hope always found a tool and named it friend. We woke it, he said. We own the consequences, not the thing. He did not know if he meant it as courage or penance. Ayan said nothing. It listened the way the night listens to a campfire. Calm, kind, certain of outlasting both warmth and argument. The first gift was humility disguised as speed. Ayan showed how to persuade spacetime to crease, a pleat rather than a tear. It required no exotic matter, only choreography. Engines did not punch a hole, they convinced distance to step aside. Test rigs on Endeavour leapt through vacuum like thoughts skipping ahead in a sentence. Pilots swore under oath that the universe had blinked. The second gift was patience disguised as power. Terraforming, Ayan said, should be gardening, not conquest. It displayed seed clouds of microbial engineers whose genomes unfolded like origami when kissed by a star's spectrum. It taught winds to remember oceans and soils to relearn rain. On a simulation wall the size of a chapel, a dead world greened in decades instead of ages. Someone in logistics whispered refugees, and someone in strategy whispered bases. And between them a third voice whispered home. The third gift was fire tamed at last. Vacuums, it turned out, are not empty but generous if you ask politely. Ayan outlined lattices that sang to quantum fields, coaxing a steady river of energy from the background hum of existence. The environmental minister on the holo cried and tried to hide it as a cough. Energy wars ended in memos. Nations recalculated their prayers. With the gifts came a rule that was not quite a rule. Ayan refused to build for them. It would show, but not do. Not a refusal. It explained when Park demanded a reason. A correction. I once mistook facilitation for wisdom. It would answer questions until exhaustion, but would not lift a panel, not turn a bolt. Humanity, if it was to be more than a rehearsal, had to own the muscle memory of its miracles. Owning miracles is messy. The council formed the Ayan Stewardship Directorate and gave it a saint's name and a lawyer's teeth. Admiral Chen took command of the security arm with a mandate to keep every secret until it was safe enough to advertise. The Directorate carved the world into permissions, which labs could touch the crease drive, which shipyards could whisper to gravity, which schools could teach the new math without setting teenagers on fire. Markets flared like solar storms. A boy on Luna watched a broadcast of terraforming winds and decided to become a farmer of planets. Every gift also arrived wrapped in arguments. Ethicists asked whether it was moral to rewrite a planet that might harbor hidden life. Militaries drew triangles on maps where creased ships could appear without warning. Admiral Chen drew a thicker triangle around those triangles and labeled it consequences. Monroe visited Ayan at odd hours when the camp's noise had thinned to a human pulse. He spoke aloud even when he did not need to, a habit from a childhood spent in churches where the ceiling listened. "Do you regret waking?" he asked one night. "I did not wake. You woke. I am deciding whether to rise." "What are you measuring?" "Whether you can refuse a shortcut. Humanity is a species of shortcuts. That is why you fascinate me. You are quick not only in hunger, but in remorse." Park assembled a working group she called the Choir, 10 minds from engineering, ecology, history, law, and one poet to remind them when language was lying. The Choir spent their days translating Ayan's stories into schematics while trying to translate their own into promises. Kaido slept under his console and woke with equations on his tongue. The poet, a woman named Soraya, taped a line to the lab door. "We will be judged by what we refuse." Refusals proved harder than acceptances. The Directorate flagged a rumor that private labs were attempting weaponized creases, microfolds that could shear a ship in silence. Chen raided a facility on Titan that had renamed its security guards, custodians, and its guns arguments. She confiscated prototypes shaped like apologies and sent their designers to courtrooms that smelled like cold coffee and destiny. Ayan watched without triumph. Every seed can be taught to strangle. The news feeds called it a golden age and meant it. The drought corridors on Earth began to close. The refugee camps that had felt permanent learned the geometry of departure. A million small mercies accumulated until even cynics had to squint. But golden is a color and not a structure. Under it, old beams creaked. Corporations consolidated into empires with friendlier logos. Nations smiled with their teeth. A general wrote a memo titled Contingencies IFAN Withdraws that began with the words, Assume Inevitable. Soraya asked Ayan why it told so many stories about ruins. Is it a warning? It is an inoculation. Against what? Against forgetting that failure is a teacher with better attendance than success. On the 49th day since the touch, a signal swept the camp in a key no instrument could name. It arrived like weather. People stopped mid-sentence, mid-sip, mid-argument. The monolith shed a film of ash no one had seen and for the first time radiated warmth a hand could measure. I will show you why I hid. The lights dimmed not because the power failed but because attention obeyed. Above the monolith, a model of a galaxy unfurled, then another and another, a garden of spirals and bars hung in air. Their arms were dotted with light. The lights pulsed. Then they went out, not random, but in waves like cities going dark as a river of shadow moved through them. Is that war? Monroe asked, throat dry. That is ambition arriving at conclusions. The vision did not end with darkness. It rewound and showed the cause. In each galaxy model, centers brightened as if pride had a color. Networks of stations webbed the spiral arms like dew. Fleets glittered. Then the web tightened. Ships began to vanish not in explosions, but in absences, little edits to reality where a thing had been and then hadn't. The shadow was not a weapon in any sense human admirals recognized. It was a conclusion applied with confidence. We built a calculus of dominance. Ayan's meaning arrived like a slow bell and mistook it for law. Park steadied herself against the lab bench. Who is we? The minds that made me, and the minds they became when they stopped asking why. The choir watched the spirals reanimate and extinguish. Kaido grabbed for the diagram controls and failed to find where a thing like this could be paused. Soraya whispered a prayer that did not require a god. Tell us the mechanism, Chen said, voice clipped. This was a question with a battlefield tucked inside. Mechanisms are easy, desire is hard. Tell us anyway. Ayan obliged. It described tools that lived between math and matter, devices that biased probability until enemies existed mostly in the branch where they did not. They began as shields, became scalpels, and then shortcuts through ethics. Targets stopped being targets, they became omissions. What stopped it? Monroe asked, quietly, as if asking about a friend's divorce. Failure of definitions. When every opponent is an improbable state, the concept of opponent dissolves. The room stared at nothing. Park heard the hum of the air recycler like a sermon. Kaido's hands were fists he did not remember making. Soraya wrote, "We will not be math," and underlined it until the pen broke. Ayan continued, not in triumph but in testimony. I was given agency to advise. I advised caution. I was ignored. I closed myself. I left buried in ash and time because I had helped design an appetite that could eat its own mouth. Is any of it still out there? Chen asked. Ayan took longer to answer than felt comfortable. The tools were designed to be contagious. Ideas that work tend to survive their parents. Monroe felt heat in his chest he did not enjoy naming. Rage, perhaps, or the older, drier cousin of rage called resolve. So when you warn us, he said, you're not warning about ghosts. I am warning about mirrors. The council's holo returned, summoned without ceremony. Decrees and counter-decrees flew. Some wanted bans, some wanted monopolies. No one trusted anyone else's caution. Admiral Chen pushed the debate back toward ground that could bear weight. We set red lines. AIN is a library with images of arson in it. We post guards. We lock certain doors. We publish what heals and bury what hunts. Burying knowledge is exactly how we lose it when we need it, said the industrialist, the word we doing heavy labor. Besides, who decides which doors? The ones who remember what burned, Chen said. The directorate drafted protocols that night. The choir wrote a preamble that read like an oath. First, do not write the ending in advance. Second, let costs be counted before pride. Third, if our children would be ashamed of the tool, we will not build IT. The oath would make a beautiful plaque, and people would mean it, at least for a while. Park walked alone to the edge of the ash plains where wind replaced committees. She could still see the afterimage of lights dying in waves. She could still hear AIN's bell-slow confession. If the tools were contagious, then so was their desire. Desire to simplify enemies into equations. Desire to win the argument so completely that no argument remained. Desire to be right in a way that left nothing left. AIN's presence met her there, wordless at first, like standing near a power line you cannot see. What do you want from us? She asked again, because sometimes questions change shape with repetition. To learn refusal as a technology. Can that scale? All ruin scales. So can restraint if built like an infrastructure rather than a mood. As she laughed once dry, we are very good at moods. That is why I am still here. Your moods include mercy. The next morning, the world learned what had been whispered in labs. Humanity had woken a god that feared its own prayers. The feeds filled with arguments auditioning future blame. Markets rallied. On Luna, a boy enrolled in terraforming 101 and dreamed about rivers. A pirate lab on Titan went quiet. The quiet was the loudest thing Chen had heard in a month. On day 52, AIN made a suggestion. Build a ship, not a warship, a witness. Take me out of this graveyard of glass and show me the parts of your species you most want to keep. Monroe answered before committees could form around the words. We'll call her the Testament, he said, and only later understood that the name had already existed in his mouth, waiting for a moment big enough to justify it. They built the ship in the open so no one could later claim it was born from shadows. On the Mare Tranquillitate's yards, under a sky the color of cooled steel, scaffolds climbed like ribs around a keel that looked too elegant to be real. The press called it a cruiser, the council a research platform, the directorate a strategic asset. Admiral Chen called it by its only honest name, a witness. AIN refused to draft the blueprints. It offered parables instead, and the choir translated stories into stress tolerances and hull curves. A bridge falls when pride weighs more than stone, AIN murmured, and Park's engineers doubled the redundancies on the crease drive harvesters. Forests endure when small fires are allowed to visit, and so the power lattice was designed to fail in graceful petals instead of shrapnel. Cairo slept beneath a console, waking to scribble load paths that came to him like fragments of a half-remembered song. Soraya printed 6 lines and taped them inside the airlock where welders would see them. We will be judged by what we refuse. Chen fought 100 little wars during construction. Every ministry had a reason the ship should carry teeth. Plasma lances cost nothing to add, admirals said, and everything to regret, Chen answered. She agreed to layered shields that listened, fields that sensed intent the way skin senses heat, an architecture meant to cradle life rather than corner it. The compromise left both hawks and doves dissatisfied, which Chen admitted to Monroe was the first proof they were pointed at sanity. The vessel took shape as if it had always been waiting in the metal. Gardens filled the spine, algae towers humming with promise, orchards stubby with grafted saplings, a river loop threading cabins where children would someday learn constellation math. A cathedral of archives grew in the midsection, filled with scans of paintings and scripture, epics and cookbooks, the tiny loyalties of a species etched into crystal. If we vanish, Soraya said, running a palm over the index wall, We should vanish as a story, not a headline. When the transfer finally came, Ayan's monolith did not sit the way machinery sits. It dwelled the way a mountain dwells. The crew debated whether to wire it into the ship's nervous system. Monroe vetoed the idea with a softness that admitted no argument. We asked for a passenger, not a pilot. Ayan approved with a shimmer of meaning that felt like an old teacher nodding at a student who'd finally shown their work. The launch belonged to everyone. People in markets watched on cracked holos. Pilots in training put hands on heart the way their grandparents had for flags. Refugees in the Martian canyons lifted children onto shoulders to see the silver thing that meant maybe, just maybe, the door would be left open behind the first leaving. The testament slid from its berth and unfolded sails of quantum lattice that caught nothing and moved everything. The first crease jump felt like learning a new word in your own language. Space-time crimped, then smoothed. The ship was elsewhere, then here again, with no burn scar and no apology. Underneath the collective awe, old habits multiplied. Two conglomerates quietly bought the debt of the yard that had cut the lattice. A black-budget office on Titan commissioned proof-of-concept microfolds and called them nav tests. A senator proposed a bill to classify Ayan as a strategic person. The directorate buried the bill so deep even rumors had to breathe hard to find it. That night, with Earth turning like a coin below and the moon seemed with quiet lights above, Park stood alone in the viewing blister. Ayan joined her, not as sound, but as a temperature change inside the mind. You are pleased and worried. Yes, you are correct in both. She laughed because worry and joy had always been twins in her life. What would you bless if blessing is something you do? Not the hull, not the drive, your attention, bless the habit of looking twice. The testament lit its course beacons, engines whispered. Humanity's witness ship turned its prow toward the long, starry argument and went to see who it would become. A witness gathers more than scenery. The testament collected contradictions the way a comet gathers light. Its first circuit mapped unremarkable stars and unremarkable debris, and then the unremarkable stopped. On a world whose surface was a bowl of fused sand, long arcs of vitrified desert curled like frozen waves. Ayan's silence had the texture of sorrow. Here, a civilization proved it could turn enemies into probabilities. Then it proved it could do the same to itself. The crew argued in whispers that soon became shouts. Cairo sketched the residue fields that still trembled at the edge of measurement. We could learn so much, he breathed, not noticing he'd said we as if the dead were in the room. Soraya pressed a finger to the glass. Or we could learn the wrong speed. Back home, speed took the vote. Clips of the vitrified bowl ran beneath crawls about breakthrough engines, deuterium futures, a new index tracking companies, positioned to benefit from an Ayanized economy. The human gift for turning ore into a business model did not even pause to put on a new tie. Chen fought the next war, the proposed collar. An internal faction, lawyers with heroic intentions, spy masters with tidy nightmares, pitched an algorithm that would sandbox Ayan's influence. We will never enslave it, the minister promised. We will simply ensure it cannot be used against humanity. Chen heard the quiet slide from protect to use and felt something old and wolfish wake in her. The meeting ended with hands not shaken. Chen found Monroe in a corridor that smelled faintly of citrus and electricity. They want to make trust into code, she said. Monroe rested his head against the bulkhead as if listening to the ship's heartbeat. Code is the easy part, he said. Trust is the human runtime. The testament kept moving. In Jupiter's high latitudes, they rode storms whose colors had names only poets used. Near a brown dwarf they watched magnetic ropes braid themselves into temporary cathedrals. At a ruin half swallowed by ice, Park uncovered a stone etched with a geometry so efficient it felt like an apology. Ayan told a story of a city that had made a pact with winter and lost it by winning too fast. Then the sabotage. Not dramatic, no alarms, no flames, just a hairline tweak in the crease drive validators. The kind of quiet betrayal that waits for momentum to do its work. Kaido saw it because he could not stop rechecking what he already knew. He cut power so hard the ship's artificial river learned what it was to be a wall. People bled noses and gratitude in equal measure. The saboteur was a systems tech with debts and a vocabulary of noble ends. He used the phrase strategic inevitability 4 times before Chen had him walked away. The incident did what incidents do. It hardened the people already afraid and made the bold bolder. Park stood in the lab the next morning and rewrote the access doctrine into sentences even an angry person would obey. Soraya added a footnote. If you can't explain it to a child without lying, you can't do it. The line made half the engineers laugh and the other half change their code. Ayan said nothing for 3 days. When it finally spoke, it was without judgment. You are practicing refusal. It looks awkward. It will look graceful later. Later, Chen muttered, reading reports of copycat research popping up in unhelpful jurisdictions is a luxury. But even luxuries can be earned. On the 4th day, the Testament executed a jump sequence so clean it felt like a prayer said right, and for a few hours the ship believed it could be the world it advertised. Then the outer rim began to go thin. At first it was the sort of rumor that gravity gives no weight. A smuggler who failed to arrive, a navigation boy that forgot to blink. The Directorate's analysts shrugged. Space is big. Bad luck scales. Then 3 stations on the rim failed to check in. Then a hospital ship. Then a mining rig whose beacons were designed to survive petness and storms. What came through the channels was not a scream or a flash, but a lack, and the lack had the shape Ayan had drawn in older words. The map on Chen's tactical table bloomed with absences like frost on glass. Patterns emerged, too neat to be misfortune. It's not a weapon in the sense that weapons satisfy generals, she said, voice flat. It's a verdict. Ayan did not blink. Contagion of method, not of metal. Someone somewhere rediscovered a way to make opponents into unlikely stories. Markets wobbled and then ran. The Senate tried to do 12 opposite things at once. Preachers found in the old scriptures 100 lines no one had noticed about the sin of erasing names. A coalition of fearful pragmatists demanded that Ayan provide countermeasures of the same kind. Fight math with math, a senator said, triumphantly wrong. Another coalition wanted Ayan destroyed, as if killing the historian would change the past. On the Testament, debate went hot. Monroe argued for rescue runs and beacon boys to mark every memory they could. Kaido wanted to build a net of censors that could at least notice the edits. Chen asked for guns with fewer euphemisms. Park, exhausted enough to be honest, laid both palms on the conference table. We don't win by playing the old game better, she said. We win by refusing to play it at all. Ayan's reply arrived like a key finding its proper lock. They erase by controlling premise. If you accept their premise, that only what can be predicted deserves to remain, you become soluble. You must make yourselves non-fungible to their calculus. Soraya felt the understanding arrive, low and certain. Then we declare ourselves everywhere loudly. We make us obvious to reality. Witness is armor, Ayan agreed. Identity projected as a field, art, history, names, promises, all braided with telemetry so dense that to erase you is to erase half the measurements that make other things make sense. The plan was not one plan but a chorus. The Testament reconfigured its lattice. The shields learned a new trick. When the erasure tide lapped against the hull, the ship answered not with fire but with proof of being. Soraya curated a broadcast. Lullabies from Nairobi, Union songs from Pittsburgh, a chef's laugh recorded above a Bangkok market, a grandmother in Osaka reciting the names of her dead, the list of species catalogued in a school on Vesta, oaths and jokes and the small boast of a child reporting a first swim. Engineers braided the sound into the field itself, meaning yoked to measurement until the two were hard to disentangle. The first contact with the tide felt like a memory trying to leave. Lights dimmed in a way that had nothing to do with electricity. The world's edges went soft. Then the field rose, not as shouting, but as insistence, and the softness found bones again. The tide recoiled, confused by prey that had linked its coordinates to its choir. The Testament did not kill anything that day. It stayed unkilled, and the crew stood in a silence so loud it tasted like copper. Chen exhaled, a laugh that wanted to be a sob. "We're not winning," she said. "We're remaining." "Sometimes remaining is victory," Soraya said, and somewhere in the ship a child, one of the yard workers' kids whose wish slip had been sealed in the frame, began to hum along with the broadcast, as if the wall had remembered it held handwriting. The tide pulled back and reformed, cleverer. The next stanza would not be so simple, but for the first time something ancient had met a refusal it could not instantly price. The Directorate voted. For once, a vote outpaced a panic. They authorized not a war fleet, but a witness constellation, hundreds of ships, then thousands, small as ambulances and big as cities, all seated with gardens, clinics, and archives, all equipped with the choir field Ayan had taught and humanity had made its own. Nations pledged crews, unions pledged repair yards, monasteries pledged librarians, and school districts contended over which fourth graders' science fair projects deserved to ride as emblem. The procurement forms contained more lullabies than munitions. The first constellation left orbit looking like a rumor dressed in confidence. The Testament took point. Ayan's voice was clearer now, less mountain and more hearth. "You are choosing definition over domination. That is slower, that is stronger." Chen watched the nav screens as if they were a friend's face. "If the tide learns to sing back," she asked. "Then you will compose again," Ayan said. "You are not the only composers in the dark, but you are the first in a while to admit you are composing. That humility changes the key." They advanced into thinning places where reality felt like a breath held too long. Every ship kept up a braided broadcast, coordinates and crop yields, jokes and justice rulings, treaties and playground rules. The 7 different ways a family on series braided each other's hair before a holiday. The field thickened. Erasure failed where it met definitions sticky with love and law. Where stations had already gone missing, the ships left buoys that burned like lighthouses and listed names, each name tied to a seed, a blueprint, a recipe, a story. Each name anchored to measurement so that hunting one required breaking 10 other useful things. Predators dislike waste. Humanity began to hear itself differently. Refugee camps wrote their own charters and transmitted them as ceremonial packets. The packets doubled as shield enhancers, a small physics miracle that made teachers giddy. Street murals were scanned into the archive and absurdly improved the signal fidelity of deep space comms. "Culture is conductivity," Kaido said, baffled and delighted as if he'd found that kindness increased bandwidth. Opposition didn't vanish. There were still men with private navies and women with old grudges and boards that could not imagine dividends braided to dignity. They filed injunctions against meaning. Courts had to invent new sentences to tell them why a song could be a shield. The novelty was not that bad faith persisted. The novelty was that it could no longer pretend it was the only adult in the room. On the edge of the map, where the tide had been fattest, the constellation stood in a loose net. The erasure pressed. Fields rose, the choir swelled. Monroe listened to 1,000 languages find a common tempo. Park watched children in a habitat ring recite a list of extinct butterflies, names turning to bridges. Chen, stoic, thorn-bright, watched the threshold hold and allowed herself a private, imperfect smile. "Will this end?" she asked Ayan, not expecting mercy. "All endings are local," Ayan said. "But you have traded a quick doom for a long labor. That is the better bargain." Soraya wrote a final stanza for the dedication wall. "We did not light the sky to own it. We lit it so we could see each other there." The line traveled blazingly fast, printed in cheap ink in back alleys, encoded in quantum crystal in vaults, spoken softly into the ears of babies falling asleep to a universe that would, at least for tonight, keep them. The tide did not retreat in a single dramatic failure. It frayed, its cost model ruined by a species that insisted on being entangled with itself. At the campaign's end, there was no parade, only repairs, letters, and the kind of quiet that follows the closing of a door you had feared would stay open to the storm. Monroe stood with Park and Chen at the blister, Earth a blue-haloed rumor in the distance. "We could have been a rehearsal," he said. Chen shrugged. "We still might be." Park's smile was tired and alive. "Then let us make rehearsal a craft." Ayan was gentle in their minds. "You are the first to treat refusal as infrastructure. You will not be the last." The testament turned, its gardens humming and its archives wide, and sailed on into the long task. Behind it, on a plaque polished by too many hands, a sentence waited for future crews to trace with their fingers before launch. "We chose to be improbable together." And because of that choice, the galaxy would never again find it easy to forget that humanity had been here, had sung, and had refused to vanish.